Okay, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us. This is the first webinar of the Debt-Free Justice National Campaign. The campaign has a goal of abolishing fees and fines in all 50 states, particularly, and we're focusing on fees and fines imposed on young people. Laws have been passed in several states, either partially or completely abolishing fees and fines on young people. And the goal of this campaign is to abolish those in all 50 states. So the campaign has a lot of resources, and we want to share that information to build momentum to continue the effort to change the laws in all 50 states to abolish these fees and fines. So this webinar, our first one, is the beginning of a series. And we'll talk some more about what the rest of the series will look like and opportunities for you to participate in various ways. So without further ado, and also just want to mention the campaign has a website now. It's up. It's at debtfreejustice.org. And I'll mention that again later. So without further ado, I want to introduce myself and my panelists. My name is Michael Harris. I'm with the National Center for Youth Law, and I've been with them for almost 10 years now. I focus on a range of issues relating to young people, usually in the context of the juvenile justice system or school to prison pipeline. And I've been doing work to abolish fines and fees for almost 9 years now here. Before that, I did a range of civil rights work, almost always focusing on racial justice issues. And I've been doing that for coming up on 30 years. Now I'd like to turn the floor over to my esteemed colleague and allow him to introduce himself. Ernest?
Good morning or good afternoon for those who are on the East Coast. My name is Ernest Johnson. I am the director of Ubuntu Village Nord, which stands for New Orleans, Louisiana. I am the director. We work with young people and parents who are impacted by the juvenile justice system to transform it and to eliminate fines and fees. We also create resources and also allow parents to educate themselves around advocating the juvenile justice system. So thank you and for having me here today.
Okay, thank you for being here with us. So just want to let everybody know that if you have questions as we go through the presentation, please feel free to put it into the chat and we'll try to deal with the questions as we go along. We are trying to make this as interactive as possible. Please feel free to jump in with questions. We're happy to entertain those. Okay. So the topics we're going to deal with today is we're going to start off, and most of our time will be spent talking about structural racism, what that is, how it plays out in this country, and why it relates to fees and fines. And then we'll also spend a little bit of time on implicit bias because that's an important factor on how fees and fines land on communities of color. And then we'll spend the last part of our presentation going through the highlights of the work Ernest and his organization and partners have done to successfully overturn fees and fines in Louisiana. So off we go. So what we want to entertain today, what we're going to get at, what we're going to try and deal with is how does the racialized nature of the court system in general lead to the perception of the appropriateness of charging youth and their families for coming in contact with the courts. And by racialized, I mean that there's this belief, there's a notion that the juvenile justice system in general and detention and incarceration in particular are uniquely spaces that are racialized, meaning those are places for youth of color, but really not so much for white youth. And so a little later on, I'll show you some information that breaks that down more. But it's that perception, that general perception that exists in the public and among stakeholders in the juvenile justice system that leads to harsher treatment to youth of color and them ending up with more fines and fees. And so I want to get into why that's true, why that is so, and how it has come about. So that's what we're going to talk about in terms of structural racism. All right. Here's a definition of structural racism that I think is the best one I've seen so far. There are several, and several of them are really good, but this one I like a lot. So structural racism, and I'm just going to go all the way back to the beginning. Structural racism is a project, quote unquote project, that was used to justify the desire to take Native Americans' land and the genocide that went along with that, and to force Africans into slavery in order to force them to work for free. That is what structural racism was created for. So how is that? There was a need to justify those horrendous practices, since the very same people who signed the Declaration of Independence were at the same time enslaving Africans. You remember what the Declaration of Independence said: we hold these truths to be self-evident. All men were created equal, but not really, not so much. So you had a dissonance right there. Further, one of the main reasons the settlers left England and came here was so that they could exercise the ability to worship freely, as they saw fit, as earnest Christians. But as many of you know, that religion has a fundamental command, which is you should love your neighbor as you love yourself. And so that obviously was not in accord with slavery or genocide. And so in order to convince everyone that the horrible things they were doing were okay and justified, they had to come up with some explanation or excuse. And the strategy they used to get around this was to assert that Africans and Native indigenous people were less than fully human. And the way they did that is they used this made-up concept of race that allowed this to become the dominant belief system. Everybody had to buy into it, and it has worked. They sold this to everybody. And the idea that they sold was that all humans could be scientifically divided up into groups called races. And more importantly, that by itself was not that important. Well, it was important, it was fundamental. But the key part of how this plays into structural racism is the races were not all the same. They weren't equal. One race, the whites, was superior and the best and on top, and the others came lower on the totem pole, with Blacks and Natives being on the bottom. And if people would buy into that notion, that narrative of racial difference, then these terrible things they were doing to those people wasn't such a thing, because they weren't really fully human and they weren't entitled to be treated as full human beings. And so every aspect of this society was used to constantly reinforce this myth of race and of racial hierarchy, including history, culture, even the sciences were pulled in for a long time. I mean, that's basically how they sold the notion of race, was to have the top scientists of the day opining that this was something that was scientifically based. And we have since learned from science that it is no such thing. There's no scientific basis for race. It's all made up, and there's no way you can consistently divide people into races. But nonetheless, we still treat race as real, even though we all know on an intellectual level, it's fake, it's phony, it's not real. We all act like race is real. And as such, structural racism allows the dominant group to credibly blame oppressed groups for the miserable outcomes. And I'm gonna go through some of those in a minute. And in every domain, across every domain, we're gonna focus here in juvenile justice and fines and fees, but those outcomes that are terrible exist across the board. And yet the oppressive group can avoid responsibility for creating the inequitable societal structures that inevitably lead to those dismal outcomes. And the oppressive group justifies these outcomes on the grounds that youth of color break the law more often. Well, it turns out research shows that's not the case. But if you buy the narrative of racial difference, it's the oppressed group's fault. There's no responsibility of the oppressor to do anything to change. And that's how structural racism lives and exists. Okay, I'm gonna show a video now. It's only about 3 minutes. And it's gonna go through some of the major milestones that have happened in this country that illustrate the structural things that were put in place that, like we've just been describing, on a structural level, creates advantages and opportunities for the oppressive groups, for whites, and denies those opportunities to people of color. Okay.
And a big part of the issue when creating a multiracial, multi-ethnic democracy movement is an understanding of how race and racism were constructed in the United States through law, and how those laws informed our culture in much the same way those corporate rights have been constructed through the law to ensure rule of the wealthy minority over the majority, and how our culture reinforces and legitimizes that lack of democracy. Right from the very beginning, Article 4 of the US Constitution defined people as property. You see, the authors of the Constitution were very interested in protecting their property, including slaves. No person held to service or labor in one state under the laws thereof, escaping into another, shall, in consequence of any law or regulation therein, be discharged from such service or labor, but shall be delivered up on claim of the party to whom such service or labor may be due. The Indian Removal Act of 1830. Indigenous communities are forced from their homelands. Over 10 years, 100,000 Native children and adults marched thousands of miles west into unknown arid territory. 15,000 do not survive the journey. But over 25 million acres of land is made available for white settlers. 1854, the People versus Hall. Non-whites are barred from testifying in court. No black, mulatto, or Indian shall be allowed to give evidence in favor of or against a white man. 1857, Dred Scott versus Sanford. Free blacks are taxed, but still have no rights of citizenship granted to whites. 1862, Emancipation Proclamation in District of Columbia. Slaves are freed in DC, but former slave owners are reimbursed for slaves given up. Whites are paid over $1 million in reparations for lost property. 1862, Homestead Act. 50 million acres of formerly indigenous land in the West, having been violently invaded by US soldiers in violation of treaties, is distributed by the government at low cost to white settlers only. And 100 million acres of indigenous land are given for free to railroad developers. 1882, Chinese Exclusion Act bans immigration of both skilled and unskilled Chinese laborers. 1924, Johnson-Reed Act creates an immigration quota system based on national origin, favoring Nordics over the inferior races of Asia and Southern and Eastern Europe. 1934, in the wake of the Great Depression, the National Housing Act is implemented, creating a federal housing authority to provide loans and federal subsidies for home ownership. But the FHA mortgage underwriting standards discriminate against non-whites and investment in non-white communities through a process called redlining. 1942, an executive order forces 111,000 Japanese Americans into concentration camps. And the war on drugs declared by Richard Nixon violently targets and imprisons people of color disproportionately through today.
Okay, I want to have a question for the audience now. So if you could type into the chat what state you are from, and just put that in the chat box and share with everybody. Thank you. Oh yeah, great. Okay, great. Thanks, everybody. And keep going if you haven't put that in yet. The reason I'm asking is we're in, as I said at the beginning, we're in a national campaign. And so I just wanted to see how representative this audience is. Part of our work is going into new states. And so we want to be able to reach out to folks and try and build momentum in new states to pass laws to eliminate fees and fines. So that's our overarching goal. And I'll come back to that point a little bit later. So just picking up where I left off, and talking about how structural racism was used as a way to justify the treatment of people of color from the very beginning of the origins of this country. I want to now be more specific in tracing out how that has played out in relationship to the juvenile justice system and fines and fees. And so I'm going to walk through several periods and try and make that connection. So starting with slavery, this is a picture from a museum that I snatched. I probably should get attribution, but this picture just really encapsulates so much for me in terms of how slavery operated and how structural racism came into play. So, I mean, the most important point is how brutal and vicious and violent slavery was. And I think this picture captures that in a very real, visceral way. But when I look at the picture, there's stuff that jumps out at me that's just like really like, woo. So one thing is the guy, putting the beat down on this guy on the ground is also a slave. And so the dehumanizing aspect of slavery was the people who were enslaved had to do inhumane things, inhuman things, because they were forced to do it because of their bondage. So that's one thing. The other thing that jumps out at me is if you look at the faces of the woman here and the child here, the viciousness of the beating is just obvious on their face. It's repulsive to them, it's so vicious. But yet, homie right here is like, this is just everyday, activity, no big thing. That contrast is just startling when you look at this picture. And that's the real subtext of slavery, is like, it worked because it was so brutal and violent. And I use that word carefully when I said it worked. I only mean that in an economic sense. It certainly didn't work for the people who were enslaved. But some economists did a study and showed that the production of cotton was 400% higher during slavery than before. And so what that tells us is that the amount of brutality and violence that was visited on the people who had to plant and pick that cotton was so extreme that they had to work all the time, all day long, and they were producing way, way more than people who were paid to do that work. So that just gives you a sense of the brutality of slavery. And I'm sorry, I can't constrain myself. Don't fall for the hype, because there's some deniers who are trying to come after the fact and say, oh, slavery wasn't that bad. There's still white people saying this now. Black people benefited from slavery because, well, they never would have been in this country in the first place. Don't buy that stuff. This is the real. This is how it really was. I don't think there's anybody who would want to get that kind of beat down on a regular basis and think that was a good thing or they would want that. So during slavery and immediately after slavery, there was a creation of this thing called slave patrols. And slave patrols were created in order for the people who were enslaving to make sure that none of their people got away. And so again, you know, if people were content, they wouldn't be trying to escape. And escape was definitely something that was tried over and over and over again. I'm sure you've heard about the Underground Railroad and other means that people used to get out of slavery. It was a real thing, people trying to get out of it. But the slave patrols, sorry about that, is where we begin to see the beginnings of law enforcement. And so slave patrols, some of them had badges that look very similar to the badges that law enforcement wears today. You can see that in the picture there. All white men were required to do rounds on the slave patrol. So that tells you how big of an enterprise this was, slave patrols, to make sure that enslaved people did not run away or get escaped. And the important piece, here it comes again, they were violently captured and brutally punished if they were captured trying to escape. And then, as I indicated before, slave patrols later became what we came to know as the police. And again, continue, so there's no surprise that Black males in particular, but other people of color too, are treated very aggressively and are seen with suspicion by police up until today. Okay, so immediately after slavery ended, there was this thing called convict leasing. And convict leasing is this idea, it's a ruse basically, it's a gambit. As you saw in the video, the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, which abolished slavery, said there shall be no more slavery except for when someone is convicted of a crime. And so what they did in the South after slavery was to use that loophole as a way to reinstitute the societal structure and the economic structure that had existed during slavery. And the way they did that was through convict leasing. And so they passed laws that made it virtually impossible not to be convicted of something. So they had loitering laws, laws for not having a job, laws for all kinds of innocent stuff, innocent things. And the use of fines and fees and other monetary sanctions was also a revenue source for the criminal and they didn't have a juvenile justice system then, but a criminal justice system. And that was part of this long sordid history. And so in order to try and put back in place what had been there before, this group of white people, some of whom were called the Redeemers, gradually retook power from, this is not part of the history that is often shared. There were biracial governing bodies during Reconstruction. Reconstruction is the period immediately after slavery, where Black people who were newly freed had an opportunity to have a taste of freedom, at least for a short period of time. But the white elites who had been in charge before were like, no, we're not gonna let that stand. So that lasted for about 7 years. But interestingly, it came to an end as a result of the Hayes-Tilden Compromise, which was, there was a presidential election. that was not clearly decided by either candidate. And so the vote went to the House. And in essence, the deal that was cut was if the federal troops that had been in the South that created an environment where Reconstruction could happen and where Black people could have some freedom and protection, those troops were removed from the South, and in exchange, the presidency would go to the other party. And so after that Hayes-Tilden compromise, Reconstruction ended, and convict leasing was the rule of the day. And I want you to notice a couple of things in this picture because they're reoccurring themes. First and foremost, the guy front and center has a big old shotgun. So all these people who are in this little, I don't know what that is it a wagon train or whatever? If any of them try to escape, homie's ready to shoot them. And again, dogs to chase after them if they try to escape. So this picture is pretty clear that these are not contented people. They're trying to get away, and they have all kinds of precautions ready to stop them and prevent them from getting away. So moving forward until close to the present time, we have this era, and the groundwork was already laid, right? Because we've already talked about how this narrative of racial difference has been reinforced through every aspect of society, through history. And we've had some examples of how history is used for certain purposes other than bringing forth the truth. So we've seen recently in these battles to bar the teaching of what is called CRT, even though it's not really what they're trying to bar, where many school districts and many states are saying we can't have CRT. And by that, they're talking about removing any mention of Martin Luther King, the Civil Rights era, or Rosa Parks. I mean, it's just shocking how blatant it is. It would be funny if it wasn't so sad. But the point I'm making here is that the use of history, particularly how history is taught to young people, is a really important device to maintain structural racism and white supremacy. And so that's what that battle is all about. It's not about educating young people so they know the full truth of the history of this country. No, that's not what it's about. It's about maintaining the myth that white people are superior to all other races. And so that white supremacy impulse is what's driving that. So that leads us to the super predator myth. Because if you have a population that is willing to accept that kids of color, young people of color, are fundamentally different than other white youth, then you can fall for the okie doke. And so the super predator myth was based on a theory that was proposed. It wasn't a fact, it was a theory that was proposed by this professor, John DeLulio. He worked at this Ivy League college, and so people thought he was really smart, knew what he was talking about. And so he put out this theory that, and this was in a period of rapidly rising crime and youth crime. And so based on that fear that people had about the increasing amount of crime, this is the mid-90s, 1990s, DeLulio came up with this theory that there was going to be, these are using his terms, I'm paraphrasing, there's going to be a tidal wave of crime committed by youth of color who are remorseless, godless, and irredeemable. And so we meaning the American stakeholders who run the juvenile justice system and legislators, had to do something in advance of that tidal wave coming to protect innocent citizens, meaning white communities and suburbs, before it was too late, before it got there and devastated everyone. And so this was based on his calculations on rising crimes and his assumptions about how young people of color behave. The problem was he was wrong. He was wrong when he put it out. He put his theory out there after the peak. In fact, when he put his theory out, which was around 1995, juvenile crime rates had already started to go down. And he has since acknowledged that he was wrong, but he did devastating damage because Many states, over 20 states, changed their laws to make it easier to prosecute young people as adults as a result of his theory. And it wasn't just him. There were others who were jumping on this bandwagon and making it seem like, kids of color were super predators and were terrible, and we had to take these punitive measures and in order to stop them. And that changed the whole nature of the juvenile justice system from being one of rehabilitation and nurturing and care to being one of being punitive. And the notion was, if you can do the crime, you should do the time. And that passed in many states, including in California, where I live. But the fundamental point I want to make about that is not that John DeLulio was wrong, or not that many laws were changed, or not even that many youth of color had their lives broken by these punitive approaches and these long sentences, these long extreme sentences they were exposed to because they were tried in adult court rather than juvenile court. The fundamental point I'm making with this slide is this only worked because the ground was fertile for him to sell that theory that youth of color were fundamentally different than white youth. Okay, so we're going to take a break for 5 minutes. I'm going to stick around if you want to ask questions. I'll be here, but I know that was a lot of heavy stuff, so I'm going to pause for 5 minutes. We're going to take a break, then we're going to pick it up and continue. So let's see, right now it's 34 minutes after the hour. We'll resume at 39 minutes after the hour. Okay, thank you very much. And if you have questions, just hit me up in the chat box. Or comments, for that matter. Okay, I think our time for a break is coming to an end. If you could just type here if you're back from the break, and let me know if you're back at your screens. And you could type that into the chat box. Okay, great. I'm seeing folks responding. Okay, so my second poll for the group is, as I mentioned, this webinar is part of the Debt-Free Justice campaign, and we are in the process of trying to eliminate fees and fines in all 50 states. And if you're interested in connecting with us or doing that work in your state, go to our website. You can connect with us and we can reach out to you, or you can reach out to me individually and we can connect. I'm curious about those of you who are doing this work, trying to abolish fees and fines. This is our first webinar, and we're interested to find out if there are other webinars, topics that you would be interested to help us achieve that goal of eliminating fees and fines in 50 states. So if you have a suggestion for that, if you could put that in the chat box, that would be really helpful for us as we move forward with the campaign. We'd be very appreciative. Okay, so I'm going to speak very briefly about implicit bias, because the major point I want to make about implicit bias is how it's intricately related to structural racism. So implicit bias is something that's universal. All human beings have it. And it functions differently in different societies based on what the overarching narratives and stereotypes are in that society. And here in the United States, this has been studied tremendously using a device called the IAT, the Implicit Association Test, which determines if you have implicit bias, and they can look at it on a number of things: age, race, gender, homelessness. A wide range of things have been tested and studied. So implicit bias works in a number of ways. And in essence, what implicit bias is the automatic association between certain identity groups and certain traits or characteristics that happens subconsciously, that is outside of your conscious awareness, and it happens automatically, that is beyond your ability to control. And so there are a number of things that are important related to implicit bias, but I'm going to leave those for another webinar. I just want to touch on how implicit bias affects judges, because it's a very important aspect to why fees and fines land on youth of color much more so than white. So we all think of judges as being really fair, committed to justice, and very neutral and objective. And reality is many judges try very hard to be that. But unfortunately, they've spent their whole life in this society. And so they've absorbed all the stereotypes that exist about people of color in this country, right? And so the major ones that I'm sure you're all already familiar with is that youth of color are seen as aggressive, hostile, dangerous, and lazy. And so even judges who are trying to be fair have already absorbed these stereotypes, and they're in the back of their minds. And so they can operate when they make decisions without them even knowing about it. And there's one stereotype that a researcher did some study on that's really, really concerning. And this research is that says that there's an automatic association between Blackness and guilt. That is, judges and juries, just seeing a Black defendant walk into a courtroom makes them more likely to think that person is guilty than compared to seeing a white person walk into a courtroom. So that's just something to keep in mind in terms of how this plays out. This is all happening on an unconscious level. But there's some things that have been shown about judges that I think are important to point out. So one is, one researcher did a study that showed 97% of judges think they are above average in avoiding racial prejudice in decision making, right? So you can't have that. You can't have almost every single one being above average. Only half can be above average. So what that tells us is judges may be overestimating their ability to be objective, or what is called the illusion of objectivity. Now, as I said before, that judges have high motivation to be fair, but that is also working against this illusion of objectivity. And then another study looked at a large number of judges who took the IAT compared to Black judges, and found that 87% of white judges had a bias in preference of whites, whereas the Black judges did not have a preference for any racial group. So that's just another piece that informs why we see the outcomes we see. And I'm going to show you that in a second. Okay, so the harms of fees and fines in combination with systemic racism.